Hey, welcome to today's episode of That's Not Proper. Today we are going to have our very first guest interview. Please be gracious and merciful with me today as you listen to this episode. There was a little bit of audio flicks that you might hear, but the content for this episode is really of great value and incredibly important. I ask that you would just listen with an open heart, and please stay tuned all the way through till the end. I'm going to have some information for future episodes that actually have to do with this topic and some audience participation. Thank you for listening in today on That's Not Proper. Today I'll be interviewing and chatting with my very first guest. I want to preface by saying someone else's sexuality and gender is none of my business. It's really none of anyone's business. However, because my soul aches for the inhumane treatment of marginalized groups, today, with one of my loves, we are going to hear their story, tackle, educate, and hopefully bring some understanding and break down cognitive dissonance. Please put aside your conditioned beliefs and opinions and listen today with a desire to gain understanding and promote unity and equality. Here with me in my soul, but separated physically by 6,000 miles in London, is my sibling, Capono. Hi, Capono.
Hi.
Hi. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Why don't you, for everybody that's listening, just give us a brief blurb about you.
Okay. So my name is Pono. My pronouns are primarily they, them. I do go by he, him sometimes also. And I am a queer, transmasculine, non-binary person.
What does that mean?
Okay. So the first part of that, queer, that means that basically that I'm not straight, that I have the potential to be attracted to anybody. And so that's my sexuality. And then my gender as a transmasculine, non-binary person, that means that I was assigned female at birth. So I popped out and the doctor said it's a girl. And that's how I lived the first 20 years of my life. And so I was socialized as a girl. I identified myself as a girl, and that's how I navigated the world. And then through a long process of self-discovery, I realized that I am actually non-binary and that I am actually transmasculine, which means that I identify with masculinity as both part of my gender expression and part of my gender identity. And the non-binary part just means that I identify outside of the male-female binary.
Okay. And for those of us that maybe don't understand even just the term binary, what does that mean?
So that basically means that you get two options in life. And those aren't even really options because they're assigned to you.
I was just going to ask, you mean options in the sense of what's assigned to us by society at birth?
Okay. Yeah, and so it's a binary in the sense that they are kind of opposed to each other, so they're set up as opposites, and you can really only be one or the other in the mainstream way of thinking about gender.
I wanted to give just a brief little backstory, and I can't remember dates, but when was it that you first announced that you were transgender? Or that you were taking that path?
Yeah, I think it was, probably a little over 2 years ago. It was kind of funny because it coincided with National Coming Out Day. And yeah, so it was around October 2.5 years ago. That's when I came out to everybody.
I'm trying to remember right now if you said how old you are.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So I'm 23. And so I came out as trans at about 21, recently turning 21, I think.
Okay. Yeah. And then one thing I wanted to note, you and I have discussed doing this podcast together, this interview. We discussed it a while ago, but recently I wanted to just touch down on what ignited the fire this past week. And I think it's important because it's a commonly heard thing, within the religious community. I had posted a graphic that I'd put together, and it was the Transgender Day of Remembrance. And could you give us a little blurb about what that's about,
Sure.
the Transgender Day of Remembrance?
Yeah, so this is a day on November 20th every year where we honor and remember the trans people that we have lost to transphobic violence. And this is primarily to honor Black trans women and trans femmes because they are the most targeted group. So yeah, that's the day that's the meaning of that day.
Right.
Yeah.
And what had happened, I'm sure you remember, was that I'd shared that graphic and someone had said they need to be saved. And for those who aren't aware, I have shared in previous podcasts that I grew up in the Christian community. And the term saved essentially breaks down to saved from hell. So you're not going to go to hell, you're going to go to heaven if you're quote unquote saved. And a couple things caused me to become enraged with that graphic. One, I have a sibling who is in the trenches right now, Pono. And so my loyalty, the loyalty hairs on the back of my neck stood up. But in addition to that, I use those terms I refer to as Christianese, and I can't stand them. And it enrages me. And so when I saw that, what was so frustrating to me, and I'm not sure about you, was first and foremost, put aside your religious beliefs. These are people, because what I had shared was the 22 names of transgender women that had been murdered and this year in the United States, the ones that we knew about. And to make light of that by saying, oh, they need to be saved, when you're talking about people that had been murdered, put aside whether or not they were transgender. Oh my gosh, it just enraged me, the insensitivity of that comment. And so that's kind of what spurred the fire this past week, at least for me. And Pono, you graciously replied to that comment, whereas I'm over here using, foul language in my mind and thinking, oh my gosh, just burn it down, just burn it down. So you were very kind, you were very gracious, and I just want you to know that I appreciated that, because it would have been very difficult for me to be as gracious in that situation. One thing I thought would be good is if we could start a little bit about your story, and then, we'll go forward. But I want the listeners to understand, because I truly feel as though marginalized groups, especially when we're talking about the transgender community, are treated as though they're not even human beings. And I think it's important to hear a story, your story in this case, so that we can see that human connection, because it's a very frustrating thing to me to see the hatred and the anger and the violence and the inability to put aside personal opinion and belief and treat someone as though they're not even a human being. And so I want you to share your story so that we can gather that connection. I think where we had talked about previously, I kind of wanted to find out from you, when do you believe that your journey began?
Well, I think that I was consciously aware that, something was up with my gender and how I related to it. Beginning of sophomore year of college. And that was a time when I started exploring more with more masculine gender expression. So that was around a time when I cut all my hair off. I started wearing clothes that were more affirming to me, which to me meant that I was able to, for the first time, shop in the men's department. And so that's kind of when I first started being aware that there was something up with my gender. It wasn't necessarily like I woke up and I was like, oh, I'm trans now, let me do all these things. It was like I took these steps to be more comfortable with my expression of my gender and my body without necessarily knowing that this meant that I was trans. It was just kind of like, okay, I'm in a space now where I can be comfortable. Let me start experimenting with that.
Did you at that point have any understanding of the transgender community at that point, or was this more of an exploration of who you are?
I guess it was kind of both. started, so I started following a lot of trans people on Instagram and started watching a lot of trans people's vlogs on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
And for a long time, I was like, why am I so interested in trans people's lives? And finally, it was because I was trans. But at that time, it was just like, yeah, I want to learn more about people who are trans. I want to learn more about their experiences with transitioning, if they did choose to transition. And then, but that was kind of separated from my exploration of myself. I don't know, in some way my brain was able to divide those things because I think I still wasn't ready to name how I was feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just kind of like, okay, these are just things that I'm comfortable with. I'm just going to do these and not really try to interrogate them and see what they mean yet.
Now, during this time, you were in college. You said your sophomore year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Were you still playing basketball at this time?
Yeah. So I went to the University of North Dakota at Grand Forks, and I was on the women's basketball team. And so, yeah, I was still playing basketball. I hadn't really told anybody on my team except for one good friend. I told kind of later in this process, but for the most part, I still walked around campus, navigating it as a woman, and I was on a women's basketball team, so I was constantly being referred to as a woman, and yeah, so it was within that context that I was doing all these things.
So then, at what point did you decide to talk to family, or actually who was the first when you came to the decision that this is who you are, who did you tell first?
So I think that I told my partner at the time first. She is a cis woman. And I think I told her first. There was something that had happened that day. I think I decided to wear some particular shirt, or I looked in the mirror and saw how I looked with my short hair. And I kind of just broke down. I was like, there's something about this that feels so authentically me and so comfortable in a way that I'd never felt before. And I broke down both because I was happy to finally feel that, but also terrified because I didn't know what it meant for me. I didn't know what it meant for my relationships with my friends and family. And so I called my partner at the time and just kind of like just word vomited all of these things, my fears, how I felt. And I think I said over and over again, like, I think I'm trans, but I don't know what this means for me. And so she was the first person I told. And I think I told one of my best friends from the team. And then I think I went on to family. And I think Kavika, our brother, was the first person in our family that I told.
And how, especially with your partner at the time, how was that received?
Yeah, she basically was like, okay, sounds good. Like, I think at that time it was the best possible person to tell, because I think a lot of trans people have a real difficulty with navigating relationships, especially like if they're just realizing that they're trans and telling their partners. That's usually a big roadblock or obstacle in their relationship. Mm-hmm. And I was really lucky in that it was just kind of like a no-brainer that it wouldn't change our relationship, and that she would just be completely supportive. And she just told me that she'd like be by my side as I figured out what this meant for me. So it was the best thing that could have happened, was telling the first person.
And then how long after would you say then that you started moving towards transitioning for yourself?
Yeah. So it kind of took a while. So I was at UND, North Dakota, for like 3 more months. And then I decided to quit basketball there and transfer. And then I transferred to a small liberal arts school in St. Paul. And it took another 6 months there of kind of being in the closet, being referred to as a woman, because there's a lot of interesting things to be talked about here, but I transferred to what was a Catholic women's college.
I wasn't sure if we were going to touch down on that.
Yeah, we can if we want. So I mean, you go there and you're automatically assumed to be a woman, because that's that's how the school marketed itself. So it took another 6 months of me being on the basketball team, realizing that I would not be able to stay in the closet for another 2 months or for another 2 years. So at the end of that basketball season, I came out to my coach and told him that I was trans and that I wanted to start hormone therapy, go on testosterone. And that was a big choice because you can't compete on a sports team, on a women's sports team, while you're on hormone therapy, while you're on testosterone, because it is considered a performance enhancing drug. And I also didn't really want to be on the basketball team and continue to be referred to as a woman. So it was another probably 8 or 9 months before I started steps toward social and medical transitioning, which isn't a choice for everybody. Some people choose to medically transition and some people don't, but that was what I decided to do.
I actually want to talk about that in a second.
Sure.
But what my question I did have was, what our listeners don't know, but I do know, is that basketball was a huge part of your life. I mean, from when you were real little. And you were very, very, I'm assuming I haven't seen you play basketball in years, but very, very good. And you were, desired to be on many teams. And so I'm just curious how that played out for you, did you feel like you had to give it up for this? And were you okay with that? Or was there something else there, the way that played out for you?
Yeah, I think, basketball was a huge part of my life for a long time. And it was a big part of my identity. And it was a large part of how I defined myself. But, part of the reason I decided to transfer from North Dakota was because it was such an unhealthy environment for me and my teammates. It was toxic. It was emotionally abusive. And that took a lot of my love and passion for basketball away from me. And so I kind of see it as something that was kind of taken from me. And so it might not have been as easy to choose between transitioning and basketball if that hadn't been taken away, because when I did transfer, it kind of came back a little bit, but I'd kind of been able to see that I didn't have to define myself wholly in terms of basketball and being an athlete and being a jock. And I think at this point I was really ready to kind of move beyond that space and move beyond defining myself in those terms and start finding new ways to meet people and make connections and also find out who I was without basketball. So I think it wasn't as hard as it could have been. It was still difficult. I think I spent a while going back and forth between, am I going to go on T or am I going to keep playing basketball? But I've never regretted it. I think it was definitely the right choice for me.
And so then when you transferred to the new school, how were you received there then? Because when you initially went, had you begun or had you not begun to take the steps towards transitioning? At what point did you do that?
So I hadn't taken any steps towards social transitioning. So I hadn't told anybody that I wasn't a woman and I hadn't figured out what my pronouns yet were. I had cut my hair at that point. So I had short hair. I was addressed as a guy outside of basketball, but I mean, at that time, I was just kind of assumed to be a gay woman, which I kind of just leaned into. I was like, okay, yeah, that's how I'm going to leave this for now. Which is also interesting because the day I moved in, I met my roommate that I was supposed to be living with. And then after she met me and saw me, and I think I told her something about my partner who was a woman, she kind of disappeared and I never saw her again after that. Yeah. So, and I found out later that, she was like, oh, I'm rooming with a lesbian. I can't, I have to get out. So that was kind of like, okay. So I was just received a little with some hesitance there, but I think for the most part, people really received me with open arms because this school, while being a Catholic women's institution, it also had like a large, vibrant queer community. Okay. And so I was able to find people there and find spaces where I felt comfortable.
You had mentioned a moment ago with regards to the choosing to start on testosterone therapy and that some do not choose to do that. Let's explain to me first for yourself what the steps are towards, testosterone therapy and what that meant for you.
Yeah. So I think there was a lot of things to it. The concrete steps were that I had to see a therapist, like a gender therapist and a social worker first.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of had to be like, because in the medical community, it's kind of like, we don't take you at your word that you're trans, that you need this therapy.
Right.
We have to legitimize you, and we have to certify you as trans and needing this. So I had to go through those kinds of steps. But then like personal steps, it was just kind of like recognizing how I needed my body to be able to feel at home in my body, and to feel
Mm-hmm.
like I could navigate the world in a way that I felt both safe and comfortable doing. And one of the things I was most excited about with testosterone was my voice, was the drop in voice that it causes. And,
Mm-hmm.
The possibility of growing a beard, although, assumptions aren't super good at growing beards. So I still hold out hope for
they're
that.
actually not. Although your brother now, you've seen his beard, but that didn't kick in until about 40.
Yeah, so I guess I'll have to wait till 40 to grow up like that. But yeah, so those were the things that I was sure that I wanted. And they sound kind of superficial, like your voice dropping and facial hair, but for me those were kind of really things that were fundamental to me feeling comfortable in my body. And so I didn't really the only thing that had me hesitating at starting testosterone was the fact that I wouldn't be able to play basketball, but the actual changes that I knew that it would cause, I was nothing but excited for them. So it was just kind of like a no-brainer for me at that point.
So at that point, and correct me if I'm wrong or help me through this one, the decision to then begin testosterone therapy does mean a lot of change, physically for others to see now. And so as far as, like you said, the changing in your voice and the possibility of facial hair, I'm assuming correct, chest hair, is that something that comes about with?
Oh yeah. Okay. It's kind of different just because different bodies receive testosterone differently. So it kind of just depends on what changes are going to happen. But yeah, so like chest, literally hair anywhere, starts growing. So body hair is definitely like a common change for people to see.
Now, does it also enable as far as like muscle growth and things like that in a way that would give the appearance of a more masculine type of body shape?
Yeah, so testosterone therapy, as long as you undergo it under the supervision of an endocrinologist, it gets you to the testosterone levels of a cisgender male.
Okay.
And so, yes, and part of that is it is a little easier to gain and build muscle.
Okay.
But it's also like you won't all of a sudden be a huge bodybuilder after a couple of shots of testosterone. It is something that you have to if that is something that you want, it's like kind of something that you pursue through weightlifting and things like that.
And things. Okay.
Yeah.
And so my question then is, this now has given you the outer shell of what you were desiring to feel comfortable. And how did that then present with, family and friends, and how was that received and accepted or not?
So I think, going back to your question about how those changes were received, like in my social circle, I found a really good professor and mentor at my school. And so I started testosterone in the summer while I was a research assistant. And so I talked to this professor and I was like, hey, just so you know, I'm trans and I started testosterone. So, you might notice some differences over the next couple months. And I also asked if she would be willing to help me navigate this conversation with my coworkers who are also research assistants. And so that's kind of how that happened. But the thing is, like, changes are so gradual, where it was like, I kind of, I talked to people and was like, okay, like these are the changes that might happen. And, like seeing people every day, it's kind of like these changes happen without either of us noticing. And then you're 8 months down the road and you realize your voice has changed, and everyone is like, yeah, I actually can't remember what your voice sounded like before.
Yeah, I have to
It's
say,
just what I'm used to. Yeah.
I was looking at some pictures yesterday from, a couple years ago, and to now I'm like, oh yeah, that was a big change. And because it just, it like you said, it was so gradual that it just kind of became you. And even like with your voice, I remember for a period of time you would share your voice on at different points, and you would hear it in those videos. But like now I'm like, well, that's what Pono's always sounded like. What I mean? So it doesn't seem, it was very natural, the progression of it.
So I think my family, especially my mom, I think my family now is completely supportive, but they were, I think, a little nervous about the medical side of things. And I think my mom especially was kind of nervous about those permanent changes, because, you see this from an outside perspective and you're like, wow, this seems like a drastic step to take.
Right.
This seems really permanent. Are you sure? And so there were those kinds of conversations that I had to have, and kind of just be like, yes, this is what I need, and this is what I want. And, you'll see these changes, but like we said, they'd be gradual. And now my family is like, yeah, I really don't remember what you sound like. And I'm able to share, like fun little things like, oh, look at this patch of hair that's grown in where I have a little bit more hope of a beard, or like, here, listen to how my voice has changed, or like, look at how my muscles have like grown. So like, it's really cool to be able to share those exciting changes. So it was, I think, really well received.
You had shared that you were going to begin the taking tea, and that was, to be honest, that was my first thought, was not like, are you sure because this is permanent or whatever. It was more, is this safe? I love you. Are you safe? And you have been so very open and willing to hear my ridiculous questions. And that's been, I've been very thankful for that. And it's been very encouraging to see you grow and be comfortable who you are now, because I remember you younger and you were uncomfortable. I didn't know what that was at that time. I do remember that. And I am thankful that you are comfortable where you are now. In telling family and everything, what were your biggest fears in sharing with the rest of family, besides mom and Kavika and Emily? Those are our other siblings. What were your biggest fears?
I think there was a fear that I wouldn't be taken seriously. Like, a lot of family kind of sees me, which isn't a bad thing, but kind of sees me as like the crusading social justice, like super into social justice and activism. And I thought that they would kind of see me as like, oh, this is just another thing that Pono like is becoming active in, and this isn't really who he is. This is just something that, that he has read an academic article about and now wants to try. So there's that fear of not being taken seriously. There's also this fear that I would just straight up be told that, no, you're wrong. You're a girl. That's who you are. That's you can't change that. And this is how I'll always think of you. And that would kind of take away my relationship with my family. So I was really worried about how our relationships would change, and if they would change for the worse.
Okay. So with regards to telling friends and family and things like that, and the fears and the hurdles, since then, how has it been with regards to family and friends and things like that? Because there's this progression now. It's much more, there's you're firmly planted here.
I think I've been so incredibly lucky, because all of our family was kind of just like, okay, sounds good, and like immediately started using my name and using my pronouns. And I remember, like, for Emily and Shelby's wedding, and that was a time when I was just like coming out, and I hadn't seen
Emily is our sister.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Emily's our sister. She got married 3 years ago now. So, or three years ago, something like that.
It's 2 years ago.
Yeah, it was okay. So it was just when I was coming out, and there's family that I hadn't seen since like 7th grade.
Oh, from Hawaii. The family came in
from Hawaii. Yeah, the Hawaii family. And they all came in and they all were like, "Hi, Pono," and like right away. It was seamless. And I'm sure they like maybe spent a lot of time practicing, or like, which also shows like, again, like how lucky I was. But yeah, so for the most part, like, family was wonderful. And then like my partner and my partner's family, because I ended up spending a lot of time with them, because just I didn't feel super comfortable at St. Kate's while I was transitioning. They really provided a place of refuge. And I remember telling my ex-partner at the time, her little brothers, that I was trans, and they were like, "Oh, cool! We just now we have another brother in the family." Like, and like it was kids are great. So yeah, and now like family continues to use the right pronouns. My mom, she posts all these things about trans people, like in support of trans people. She tells people like on airplanes and stuff about her trans son who's doing so many cool things. And like my family's great, and like my partner now has been equally wonderful, and my being trans has never been an issue in our relationship. And it's really cool because like everything in the world, everything in society, everything that you hear tells you that you're not worthy of being loved. You're not worthy. Your body isn't worthy of being loved. You're some sort of anomaly that is unnatural, or there's all this sort of like conversation around trans people and trans bodies, and you start believing that yourself. You start thinking, maybe I'm not worthy of being loved. Maybe this is right. Maybe they're right, and maybe there is something fundamentally wrong with me. And I think it's so important to have a support network, both of family and friends, who constantly negate that and constantly tell you, no, you are worthy of this. You're worthy of unconditional love, and I'm going to love every part of you, including this trans part of you. I'm not going to ignore it or pretend like it doesn't exist. I'm just going to tell you that that's an important part of you, and you're also important as a person, and like as a whole person. Yeah. So I'm very lucky with the friends and family that I have.
Well, I decided that we're going to make this, at least a 2-part thing here. And so in closing, I really would love to hear from you, as if you were speaking to someone who's taking these steps right now in their life and the struggles that you've been through. What would you say to them as they're beginning this?
I would say that everything that they're feeling is completely valid. I would say that they don't need to know anything for sure. They don't need to feel like they need to fit some narrative out there of what it means to be trans, and that it is completely up to them how to identify themselves, and that whatever they choose, that they're loved and they're important, and that there are people there who will be there for them, even if their family or friends don't respond positively. There is always someone there that will love you and that will accept you for everything that you are, and that there's no need to hide or suppress any part of yourself to be loved.
And then also to family, friends, or even just someone who is looking in from the outside and doesn't understand, or this is all very new to them. What would you tell them so that they could maybe gain some understanding, or even just as far as support is concerned? What would you tell them?
I would say just everything that you are certain of being true, all these things that you've been taught, it's not the truth for everybody. You have to be able to be open to that, and to be open to unlearning a lot of the things that you've been taught to believe. And also, I don't know, that everyone deserves love, and everyone deserves to be validated and affirmed, and someone else's gender has no impact on your own well-being. So just be open, be critical of yourself, be really reflective of why do trans people scare you so much? Why does it spark so much emotion and anger and maybe even disgust in you, that you don't know how to react when there's a trans person around? And I think I would just say be really, really open to learning and open to self-reflection.
Thank you, Pono. As I had said before, we're going to be continuing this interview on where Pono is going to be discussing things a little bit more involved with regards to being transgender, what that means, the struggles. In addition to that, we would ask that you would send in questions or comments that you may have for myself or for Pono so that they can be included in future episodes. Please send those comments or questions to that'snotpropercorey@gmail.com, or you can private message me on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at That's Not Proper. Please remember to share and subscribe to That's Not Proper, and stay tuned for part 2.